What if the greatest turning point in European history began not in a battle, not in a royal court, but in a harbor with a single silent ship? How could a disease, invisible and tiny, shake the foundations of an entire civilization and at the same time lay the seeds for its rebirth? Imagine it is the autumn of a distant century. The wind carries the scent of salt and tar across the Mediterranean. Merchants call out, bells ring, and on the quays of Messina, people wait for silk, spices, perhaps news from distant cities. It is a world full of order and rhythm. The fields are tilled, the bells divide the hours, and people believe that everyone knows their place in God's great design. But beyond the horizon, something invisible is approaching. No army, no storm, but a silence that grows. It begins far in the east in the steppes of Asia and travels on the backs of caravans, in the bellies of merchant ships, in the darkness between crates and ropes. No one suspects that the world as they know it will fall silent in a few months. The cathedrals will continue to tower into the sky, but their sound will be hollow. The markets, just filled with voices, will become graveyards of cobblestone. And yet, amidst fear and despair in a Europe holding its breath, something new is born, a different consciousness, a new view of life, death, and humanity. This is not a story about disease alone. It is the story of a massive upheaval, of how death itself became a teacher, and how a new world emerged from the darkness of the plague. Our journey begins where everything still seems calm, in an ordered, self-assured world that does not suspect its foundation is already beginning to crumble. Europe in the 14th century was a world at rest yet unconsciously standing at an abyss. Whoever walked through the narrow alleys of Florence, Paris, or Lübeck felt a self-evident balance. The monks in their monasteries, the knights in shining armor, the peasants on the fields bowed under the weight of the harvest, and above all, the sound of church bells ordering the hours, indeed life itself. It was the age of faith and certainty. Man knew his place, and the world seemed as firmly set as the stone pillars of the cathedrals growing into the sky. The high Middle Ages had transformed Europe. Trade in cities blossomed. From Flanders to northern Italy, merchant caravans moved. New networks of markets and tolls spanned rivers and highways, and the great merchant republics of Venice and Genoa connected the continent with the Orient. Spices, silk, and stories came across the Mediterranean. Silver, wool, and wine flowed over the Alps. Prosperity grew slowly but noticeably. Guilds emerged in the cities, carrying the pride of craftsmanship, and at the universities of Paris, Bologna, or Oxford, scholars discussed Aristotle and the nature of the soul in Latin. But beneath this surface of order lay a world more fragile than it realized. People lived packed tightly in wooden houses with thatched roofs leaning over narrow alleys. Trash, slaughter, waste, and dirty water collected in gutters flowing through the streets. Rats were constant companions, invisible and everyday like the buzzing of flies in summer. Clean water was a privilege, and hygiene in our modern sense was hardly known. Daily life smelled of work, of fire, of animals, of life, and sometimes of death. At the same time, the climate began to change. After the warm centuries of the so-called medieval warm period, cooler summers and wetter winters approached. Harvests became more unpredictable, granaries emptier. Between the years 1315 and 1317, widespread crop failures and famines occurred in large parts of Europe. Millions of people suffered from malnutrition, their bodies weakened, their immune systems susceptible. Yet no one believed that this cold was a harbinger, not just of the weather, but of a time when life itself would freeze. The social structure was rigid, yet under pressure. The nobility defended its old privileges, the church its dogmas. 90% of the population lived as peasants, bound to land and lordship. They toiled for others, not for themselves. Above them watched a world of prayer and duty, where any attempt to step out of one's role was considered a sin. Nevertheless, something new was germinating. In the cities, a self-confident bourgeoisie was growing, placing money and education above lineage. Merchants in Florence used double-entry bookkeeping. Bankers in Siena lent money to kings, and on the marketplaces coins and ideas were exchanged. Europe was becoming more modern, more dynamic, and thus more vulnerable. Even faith, which held so much together, began to show fine cracks. The papacy had resided in Avignon since 1309, far from the once holy center of Rome, and many saw this as a sign of worldliness and greed for power. Theologians argued over the right interpretation of faith, while ordinary people hoped for salvation from earthly distress in processions and pilgrimages. Above all lay a feeling of security that was deceptive, like the silence before a storm. Looking back at this time today, one sees a civilization at its peak and simultaneously on the edge of an invisible crisis. Trade, faith, and order provided stability, but they also bound people into a dense web of mutual dependence. The same routes on which wealth and ideas traveled would soon carry death. The same cities that collected culture and knowledge would become traps, and the same church that promised comfort would soon lose itself in the storm. No one yet suspected that the world which seemed so ordered would be shaken to its foundations just a few years later, for behind the mountains, beyond the trade routes and caravans, the wind had already picked up something eerie, an invisible trail that would soon sweep across seas and borders. And exactly there, in the distance, the next chapter begins. In the late summer of 1347, when the Black Sea lay under a quiet, deceptive sheen, an invisible tragedy began in the port city of Caffa. Caffa, a Genoese colony on the Crimea, was then a pulsating center of trade between east and west. Amid spices, furs, fabrics, and stories telling of distant cities like Samarkand or Baghdad, there reigned the bustling activity of a world that deemed itself safe. But outside the city walls, in the dust of the steppe, lay the camp of the Golden Horde, the Mongol army under Khan Jani Beg, which had been trying in vain for months to conquer the wealthy city. Then something happened that exceeded all previous concepts of war and siege. Amidst the scorching sun, the Mongol warriors suddenly began to fall ill. They developed fevers, black swellings under the skin, and died within a few days. Whole rows of tents stood empty, horses wandered among the corpses, and even the gravediggers collapsed. The chronicler Gabriel de Mussy, a Genoese contemporary, reports an act that seems like a grim parable. Out of rage and despair, Jani Beg had the corpses of his own men catapulted over the city walls to infect the inhabitants. Whether this actually happened remains disputed in research. Modern historians point out that transmission via fleas and rats was much more likely. But even if the story is exaggerated, it symbolizes something essential: Europe's first documented encounter with what would soon be called the Black Death. Within a few weeks, Caffa transformed from a trade paradise into a city of horror. The streets fell silent, the markets deserted, and the few survivors sought salvation on the sea. They boarded their galleys, those proud ships that usually brought silk, pepper, and gems to the west, and set sail for home, to Genoa, Pisa, and Messina. But on these ships, death traveled with them. In the dark holds, rats rustled, and on their fur hung the fleas carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. No one suspected that the flight from hell would open the gates to an even greater catastrophe. In October of the year 1347, 12 Genoese ships appeared off the port of Messina in Sicily. The inhabitants, waiting for rich cargoes, saw instead a fleet of horror. Chroniclers report that the ships glided into the harbor almost silently, some with dead oarsmen at the benches, others with survivors whose bodies were covered with black spots and pus-filled boils. Michel da Piazza, a Sicilian monk, wrote that the people on the quay recoiled, as if they had felt the breath of death themselves. The city council of Messina ordered the ships to be driven from the port, but the decision came too late. The disease was already on land. From there, it spread like wildfire. Via Catania and Palermo, it reached Naples, Marseille, and Genoa. The trade routes that had brought prosperity for centuries now became paths of doom. Where ships docked, rats crawled ashore. Where markets took place, not only goods but also fleas changed owners. Within a few months, the entire Mediterranean coast was infected. By the spring of 1348, the pestilence had reached southern France, Catalonia, and northern Italy. In the summer, it stood before the gates of Avignon, the papal residence, and in the autumn, already in Paris. The speed of this spread was unprecedented. Previously, epidemics were mostly local events, limited by natural barriers and slow transport routes. But now, the dense network of trade connected the world like never before. Merchants, pilgrims, and sailors carried not only goods but also disease. The progress that had made Europe rich made it simultaneously vulnerable. In the letters of the Florentine chronicler Matteo Villani, one reads with disbelief, "It seems as if death travels faster than the wind." People sought explanations. Some believed the pestilence came from the east like a divine punishing wind. Others saw signs of wrath in the constellations. But no one could understand that the true cause was tiny, a bacterium, smaller than any speck of dust, carried by an inconspicuous insect. When the plague finally reached Genoa, the starting point of the flight, the circle of fate closed. The city that wanted to save life had unknowingly brought death home, and from here it would spread further across the continent, unstoppable, merciless, beyond borders and beliefs. What began in Kaffa was more than a pestilence. It was the beginning of a global age of vulnerability, and while Europe tried to understand the inexplicable, the true enemy was already working silently in the hidden. The enemy that haunted Europe in the 14th century was no demon, no curse of the stars, but an inconspicuous being, so small that no human of his time could see it. Yersinia pestis, as we call it today, is a bacterium that was native to the steppes of Central Asia, hidden in the earth and blood of small rodents. There, in the endless expanse between Kazakhstan and China, it lived for millennia in balance with its environment, a part of the natural cycle of life and death. But as humans began to conduct trade, war, and travel across continents, the pathogen also left its ancient habitat and found a stage in the human world that it never sought, but used with deadly perfection. The ecological chain that made this catastrophe possible was deceptively simple. In the dry steppes, pikas and marmots nested, their fleas carrying the pathogen. As long as the animals lived, the balance remained stable. But when climate fluctuations and hunting disturbed the delicate system, the fleas sought new hosts, house rats that accompanied humans into their settlements. This Rattus, the black rat, was the true mediator between wilderness and civilization. It was small, agile, frugal, and traveled on ships and wagons just as naturally as a merchant or pilgrim. Its fleas, Xenopsilla chiopus, carried the bacterium in their digestive tract. When they bit an infected host, their stomachs clogged with blood clots, and out of hunger, they bit again and again. Each time they injected a tiny amount of bacteria into the new host. Thus Yersinia pestis jumped from animal to animal, from rat to human, from city to city. The medieval cities offered ideal conditions for this. In the narrow alleys, where waste lay on the streets and sacks of grain were stored in cellars, rats found food and shelter. They lived under the floorboards, in the walls, in the pantries, close to the humans who were hardly aware of them. No one would have believed that the inconspicuous shadow scurrying across the courtyard was the actual carrier of doom. And yet, it was so. When a rat died, its fleas jumped onto the next warm body, often that of a human. The cycle began anew. Modern scientists have confirmed through genetic analysis of plague DNA from medieval mass graves that the strain haunting Europe originated in Central Asia. It likely followed the trade routes of the Silk Road, carried by caravans whose pack animals were infested by flea populations, via trade centers like Samarkand, Tana, and finally Kaffa. It reached the sea and, with the Genoese ships, Europe, an invisible traveler taking advantage of medieval globalization. But Yersinia pestis was not a rigid enemy. It was changeable, a survivor. Under certain circumstances, it remained active in rodent populations for decades, only to suddenly jump back to humans triggered by environmental changes, drought, or famine. This ability explains why the plague never completely disappeared, but returned again and again at intervals of 10 to 20 years, generation after generation. In the chronicles of that time, people looked for visible signs. They spoke of corrupted air, of a miasma released by constellations or earthquakes. No one could suspect that the true enemy lurked not in the clouds but in the dust beneath their feet. Only many centuries later, in the 19th century, Would the Swiss doctor Alexander Yersin discover the pathogen in Hong Kong and give it his name? Until then, it remained a ghost of science, a shadow that depopulated cities and then vanished again. In retrospect, it appears that the plague was not only a medical but an ecological tragedy, a breakdown of the balance between humans, animals, and the environment. It teaches that civilization builds no wall against nature, but a fine net that can tear at any time. The medieval human did not understand it, but he felt it. Something greater, incomprehensible had come over him. An opponent without a face that defied every explanation. And yet, biology alone does not explain why the pestilence spread so rapidly, why entire cities fell silent in a few weeks and villages became ghost towns. For it was not only the bacterium that was deadly, but the world in which it moved. The cities, the climate, the warehouses full of grain, the way of life of the people themselves. The plague traveled faster than anyone would have thought possible. Between its first appearance in Messina in October 1347 and its arrival in Paris hardly a year later lay more than 2,000 kilometers, a speed that would be impressive even in today's times. For the people of the Middle Ages, who believed that diseases stemmed from corrupted air or divine wrath, this pace was incomprehensible. But the answer lay not in the sky, but in the structure of their own world, in the cities, in the climate, and in the supplies that kept daily life running. The medieval city was a place of proximity, a pulsating mesh of stone, wood, humans, and animals. In Florence, Paris, or Lübeck, tens of thousands of people lived in tight spaces. Houses stood close together, often multi-storied and leaning crookedly against each other. The upper floors jutted over the alleys so that hardly any sunlight reached the ground. Garbage and waste collected in open gutters. Sewage flowed into the streets, and the smell of fire, animals, and humans lay heavy in the air. People lived with their animals under one roof: goats, chickens, cats, dogs, and rats. This proximity, the warmth, and the constant dampness formed the perfect biotope for the fleas carrying the pathogen. When a rat died, its fleas left the cold body and sought a new host, often humans. In the dark houses where whole families slept in tight quarters, the pathogen needed only a moment to spread. A single flea bite could suffice. From one house to the next, from one street to another, the disease permeated the fabric of the city. The narrow markets, the enclosed churches, the taverns full of people, all places where proximity was part of everyday life, became invisible nodes of death. But it was not just the city that accelerated death, but also the climate. The 14th century was marked by a noticeable drop in temperature, the beginning of the so-called Little Ice Age. Cooler summers and wetter winters created ideal conditions for the proliferation of rodents. At the same time, the preceding years of failed harvests weakened many people. Between 1300 and 1340, large parts of Europe had suffered from hunger. Bodies were weakened, immune defenses low, and so an infection that a healthy person might have survived became fatal for many. Climatic and social factors combined into a storm that was hardly unstoppable. Another often overlooked element was the granary, the heart of every medieval community. In the large cities, merchants and monasteries stored entire annual supplies: corn, wheat, and rye. These granaries were warm, dark, and full of life, not just human. Rats ate their way through the sacks, built nests among the grains, and where there was grain there were also fleas. When merchants reloaded the supplies or delivered them to new markets, the parasites migrated with them. Via rivers and trade routes, via wagons and ships, they moved from one place to another, an invisible army marching from pantry to pantry. Architecture itself also played a role. Cities like Venice or Genoa, built on piles or islands, had countless warehouses directly over the water. There, rats found ideal living conditions: warm, damp, and protected from natural enemies. Even the cellars of monasteries and castles were not safe. Death was not only on the streets, it was in the walls, in the foundation of civilization. Comparing the spread speed of the plague with other pandemics makes the extent even clearer. The Justinianic plague, which devastated the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century, took almost 2 decades to penetrate the Mediterranean region. The Black Death covered Europe in fewer than 4 years. The difference lay in the density of human contacts and the networking of trade routes. The Middle Ages, often described as dark, were in truth a highly mobile world, and exactly this mobility became its undoing. The pestilence used the same structures that had once brought prosperity, the same roads, the same ships, the same markets. It was the dark side of progress. The world was so networked that no place was far, no village too small, no valley too isolated to be spared. And so the disease spread not only over the bodies of people, but over the body of Europe itself, over its veins of roads, rivers, and trade routes. The speed with which it traveled was an expression of the time, a time of density, exchange, and dependencies. But speed was only the beginning. For what followed was not only the collapse of bodies, but the collapse of order itself, those invisible structures of trust, ritual, and faith that sustained life. The plague brought not only death, it brought the end of certainties. In a world where everything relied on repetition and order, the rhythm of the harvest, the sound of the bells, the course of processions, the loss of these rituals was like the loss of the ground beneath one's feet. What people experienced was not merely a disease, but a disintegration of their entire reality. In Florence, as Giovanni Boccaccio wrote in the Decameron, the love between people gave way to a coldness previously unimaginable. Brother fled from brother, father abandoned child, and hardly anyone found the courage to bury the other. These words are more than literature. They are testimony to a world losing trust. Where the plague appeared, neighbors withdrew from each other. Doors remained locked, and streets fell silent. In some cities, houses where someone was sick were barred and sealed as if they themselves were part of the contagion. The rituals of everyday life that held the community together disintegrated. Weddings were canceled, masses forbidden, markets closed. But most visible was the collapse of the rituals of death. In the churches, where bells usually rang for the deceased, silence reigned because there was no one left to pull the bells. Priests, monks, and gravediggers died in droves, and with them vanished the last bond connecting life with the hereafter. Without priests, there was no confession, no last rites, no holy burial. In Florence, chroniclers report, great pits had to be dug outside the city, into which hundreds of corpses were thrown day after day. An eyewitness wrote that the dead were layered like cheese and bread. In London, Paris, and Cologne, the same image repeated itself. In England, carts drove through the streets and drivers called, "Bring out your dead," a cruel routine that soon became normality. Those still alive avoided these carts, held their noses, and looked away, out of fear of becoming part of this silent procession themselves. It is easy to see only chaos in this darkness, yet it also reflected the attempt to deal with the incomprehensible. Some people locked themselves in, hoping walls would save them. Others fell into the opposite. They drank, celebrated, sang as if every day were the last. Contemporaries described these people as hedonistic, but in truth, it was often despair, a rebellion against the inevitable. In a time when even prayer no longer helped, one sought comfort in wine, in music, or in the fleeting laughter of an evening. Social cohesion broke on all levels. Even the hierarchies that previously seemed untouchable began to totter. Nobles fled to the countryside, leaving their subjects behind. The poor died in the cities without protection, without help. The feeling that all are equal before death permeated that time. The poet John Lydgate wrote in England that death had laid the king and the beggar in a common silence. This experience, as cruel as it was, had a revolutionary effect. For the first time in European history, the common man began to grasp his own importance in the great structure. Economically, too, the collapse of everyday life had dramatic consequences. Fields remained untilled, livestock perished, and supplies rotted. In many regions, farmers left their farms because there was no market for their harvest. Cities, once centers of trade, became places of standstill. Merchants found no buyers, craftsmen no orders. The Middle Ages, which for centuries had been determined by a fixed rhythm of work, prayer, and festivals, fell into a breathless pause. And yet, even in the collapse, the amazing adaptability of humans showed itself. New forms of burial emerged, improvised nursing, primitive quarantines, and in some places simple rituals of farewell. A cross of straw, a silent prayer behind locked doors. It was an attempt to create order where there was none. Thus, a society that had relied on faith and habit began to understand itself anew, as vulnerable but also capable of survival. The Black Death extinguished millions of lives, but it did not destroy the human will to carry on. In a time when faith was the foundation of every certainty, the plague acted like a cosmic tremor. Medieval man understood disease not as a biological phenomenon but as a message, as a sign of divine will. When the Black Death came, the question was not, what causes this? But, why is God punishing us? The plague was more than a physical suffering. It was a theological crisis, a meltdown of faith. Wherever the pestilence took hold, people sought refuge in prayer. In churches, on squares, in processions, they pleaded for mercy. But the heavens remained silent. The more they prayed, the more died. Priests who assisted the dying fell ill themselves. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Faith, which had provided comfort for centuries, now seemed to fall ill itself. In Avignon, where the Pope resided, the dead piled up so much that boats were needed to transport them across the river Rhone. The institution of the Church, which had previously been considered the mediator between man and God, lost its aura of untouchability. From this helplessness grew new forms of piety, often ecstatic, sometimes dangerous. The most famous was the movement of the Flagellants. From the year 1348, groups of men and women marched barefoot through cities and villages all over Central Europe. They wore white robes with red crosses painted on the back and beat themselves with leather whips tipped with small metal pieces. Twice a day, they performed these rituals, sang gloomy songs, and believed they could appease God's wrath by reenacting the suffering of Christ. Chroniclers report that hundreds of these penitents gathered in cities like Strasbourg, Nuremberg, and Cologne, while people knelt on the streets hoping to find salvation through their sacrifice. But what began as an expression of deep piety soon turned into an uncontrollable fever. The Flagellants preached that the Church had failed, that the priests were sinful, and the world could only be saved through penance. They attacked clergy, refused obedience to the Pope, and established their own rituals, a parallel Christianity of despair. Pope Clement VI reacted with a ban. In 1349, he forbade the processions and declared the movement heretical. But the distrust remained, and with it the longing for a visible cause. If God himself gave no answer, someone else must be guilty. Thus began the search for a scapegoat. Soon rumors circulated that the Jews had poisoned the wells to destroy the Christians. This slander spread rapidly, a second spiritual poison even deadlier than the pestilence. In many cities, excesses of violence occurred. In Strasbourg in February of the year 1349, about 2,000 Jewish people were burned on a pyre even before the plague had reached the city. Similar pogroms occurred in Mainz, Cologne, Speyer, and Freiburg. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out. The Pope himself tried to intervene. In several bulls, Clement declared that the Jews were innocent, as the plague was a work of divine power that struck them equally. But the words from Avignon went unheard. Fear was stronger than reason, and violence created a second trauma that would haunt Europe for a long time. The moral failure of a society losing its humanity in the face of death. It is significant that in the decades after the plague, a new form of piety emerged, quieter, more personal, more inward. Movements like the Devotio Moderna, which arose in the Netherlands and the Rhineland, emphasized the individual relationship with God, beyond the institutional church. People began to seek salvation not only in dogmas but in compassion and charity. The great catastrophe had not extinguished faith but transformed it. The Black Death was thus not only a biological, but also a spiritual turning point. It revealed how thin the layer of certainty lay over fear, and how quickly piety could turn into fanaticism. But in the ashes of this despair, a new thought also germinated. If God allows humans to suffer, perhaps they must learn to shape their destiny themselves. But while faith changed, the cities tried to act in a completely different way. People began to understand that prayer alone could not stop the plague. Early councils, doctors, and officials sought practical means to tame the invisible. City gates were closed, merchant ships controlled, gatherings banned. Here, amidst the fear, a completely new way of thinking was born, thinking in terms of protection, order, and prevention. As the plague overran Europe, humanity faced for the first time the question of whether the invisible could be tamed at all. Prayer, penance, and sacrifice had achieved nothing. The pestilence did not listen to divine words. In cities already on the verge of collapse, people began quietly, almost desperately, to look for new ways, no longer in heaven, but in human action itself. What emerged here was the beginning of an idea that shapes our world to this day. The idea that disease can be fought through organization, observation, and precaution. The first attempts began where death was loudest, in the harbors. In Ragusa, today's Dubrovnik, the city fathers decided in 1377 that no ship coming from infected regions was allowed to dock immediately. Instead, sailors and goods had to stay outside the city for 40 days. Trentino usually, but eventually 40 giorni in Italian. From this came the word quarantine, 40 days, because this number stood symbolically for purification in the Bible. 40 days of Christ fasting in the desert, 40 days of rain during the flood. Medieval science mixed here with theology and experience. They didn't know why it helped, but they saw that it changed something. From Ragusa, the idea spread like a silent wave across the Mediterranean. In Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, authorities began to inspect ships, check cargo, and isolate suspicious sailors. In Venice, the first lazaretto in the world was established in 1423, a special facility on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth, far enough away to protect the city, but close enough to care for the sick. The place was called Lazaretto Vecchio, named after Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers. Here, the sick were taken in, treated, and separated from the healthy as much as possible. These early health regimes were by no means perfect. The doctors of the time did not know what a bacterium was, and still considered the plague to be corrupted air. But through pure observation, through experience not theory, they grasped that proximity kills and distance protects. The idea of isolation became a silent revolution. It broke the dogma that disease was solely God's will, and put the principle of human responsibility in its place. Venice also introduced new port regulations. No ship could be unloaded before it had been inspected, and the crew examined. Guards watched the city walls, checked travelers, and cordoned off entire districts if plague was suspected. Thus emerged a precursor to what we call cordon sanitaire today, a targeted sealing off to stop the advance of the disease. Some historians see in this the first spark of state health administration ever. These measures were not only medical but political acts. They demanded discipline, trust, and the willingness to sacrifice personal freedom for the common good, an idea that was new in a time of deep individual faith. The plague forced society to organize itself. In the city councils of Florence, Milan, or Siena, discussions were held about cleaning the streets, burning contaminated clothing, and creating new cemeteries outside the city walls. Milan, which acted early and decisively, suffered comparatively fewer losses, an indication that administration and caution could achieve more than prayer and chance. Perhaps the most impressive thing about this development was its sustainability. Long after the first great wave of the Black Death had faded, the lazarettos remained. They became permanent institutions, symbols of a new order. The plague doctors with their long beak masks full of herbs may seem strange to us today, but behind their grotesque figure lay a deep thought that knowledge, caution, and organization can at least mitigate fate. Thus, from the greatest chaos in history grew a germ of modern reason. Quarantine was more than a measure. It was a turning point. For the first time, man believed he was not just at the mercy of nature, but could stand against it. But while notes with health regulations were posted in the cities, another quiet revolution began out in the fields. Death had taken half the hands away, and work on the land stood still. From the lack of people grew a new power, that of the peasants. When the first great wave of the Black Death slowly ebbed around the year 1350, Europe remained paralyzed. The stench of death gave way to silence, and this silence was eerier than anything before. Whole villages stood empty, fields lay fallow, and even the church bells rang only rarely, no longer for the dead, but for the survival of the few who remained. No one could have imagined a world where half the people were missing. But exactly that was now the new reality. In England, Tuscany, and parts of northern France, the population shrank by half, in some places even by 2/3. What initially seemed like the end of all things became, in retrospect, the beginning of a deep upheaval, for while death depopulated, it also changed the relationship between man, work, and property. The feudal system, which had supported European society for centuries, was based on a simple principle. There were many people but little land. The nobility owned the soil. The peasants worked on it, mostly without wages, bound to their lord and his estate. The Black Death reversed this equation. Now there was suddenly plenty of land, but hardly any hands left to till it. The survivors were carried by necessity to a new position of power they had never had before. Chroniclers report that sheep and cattle wandered over abandoned fields because no one was there to herd them. In England, a monk wrote, "The fields went wild and the grain rotted on the stalks because no man remained to cut it." The shortage of labor led to a drastic rise in wages. A harvest helper who had received a penny a day before the plague could now demand 3 or 4 and got them. Craftsmen and builders suddenly determined their prices themselves. The ground on which society had stood for centuries began to shake. The reaction of the rulers varied. In England, King Edward III enacted the Statute of Laborers in 1351, a law intended to reset all wages to pre-plague levels. Anyone who demanded or paid more was punishable. Similar regulations arose in France, Castile, and the Holy Roman Empire, but the laws remained largely ineffective. People could not be forced to work under old conditions when they knew their labor was suddenly valuable. In many regions, agriculture began to change. Instead of cultivating labor-intensive grain fields, landowners switched to livestock farming, especially sheep, whose wool fetched high prices on the markets of England and Flanders. Entire swaths of land turned into pasture. The landscape became more open, but also emptier. This development contributed in the long term to the rise of the English textile industry, a distant echo of the catastrophe. In the cities, the demographic collapse led to a paradoxical prosperity. Fewer people meant more space, more food, more opportunities. Houses, workshops, and plots of land fell to the survivors. Some families who had previously been poor suddenly found themselves owners. Per capita income rose, and reports appear in archives about a surplus of silver and gold, not because the world had become richer, but because it was poorer in people. This new freedom came at a price. The social hierarchies that had survived centuries began to crumble. The lords saw their power waning, while the peasants negotiated their work for the first time. In England, France, and Flanders, tensions arose and finally uprisings, harbingers of a social explosion that would shape the coming decades. Compared to other catastrophes in history, the plague was unique because it brought destruction and renewal at the same time. It wiped out old orders, but it also opened doors. Death had taught people that the world was changeable and that to survive, one had to not only pray but act. Out of necessity grew self-confidence, and out of work grew dignity. The common man began to see himself no longer as an object of foreign power, but as a shaper of his own future. This new attitude, born of pain and scarcity, would soon become the driving force of one of Europe's great upheavals, the rise of the peasants and burghers. After the first shock of the plague came a second wave, no disease but a social tremor. Everywhere in Europe, people felt that something had been set in motion. Death had torn away half the population, but it had also softened the rigid structures of the Middle Ages. The old rules no longer applied, and suddenly a question arose that no one had dared to ask for centuries. Who has the right to decide over whom? The peasants who had won the struggle for survival on the fields now recognized their value. Without them, no grain grew. Without them, no sheep fell. Without them, the world remained silent. This new self-perception was quiet, but it changed everything. When the lords tried to maintain the old order with laws like the English Statute of Laborers, they met with resistance. People no longer wanted to be subjects, but partners. And when attempts were made to put them in chains again, they reached no longer for the plow, but for the weapon. In the early summer of 1358, one of the first great peasant uprisings of the modern era, the Jacquerie, occurred in northern France. The names of the leaders are forgotten, but their anger remained unforgotten. They stormed castles, burned deeds, destroyed the visible symbol of oppression. Their uprising was crushed, but the echo lingered. Only a few decades later, in 1381, a man named Wat Tyler rose up in England. Together with the preacher John Ball, he led thousands of peasants and craftsmen from Kent and Essex to London. They demanded freedom from serfdom, fair taxes, and an end to corruption at the royal court. Chroniclers report how the insurgents entered the capital, set the palaces of the powerful on fire, and negotiated with the young King Richard II at Smithfield. It was a moment when everything seemed possible for a breath, until Tyler was murdered during the talks. The uprising collapsed, but the idea survived that power is not divine but human, and that people have the right to raise their voice. It was also fermenting on the continent. In Florence, the revolt of the Ciompi, the impoverished wool workers, occurred in 1378. For weeks they controlled the city, formed councils, demanded wages and political participation. It was the first time an urban working class took over a government, albeit only briefly. The movement was crushed, but it showed that in the cities too, power was beginning to tip. While Western Europe fell into turmoil, the East took a different path. In Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and especially east of the Elbe, the power of the landed gentry grew. Here land was plentiful, but labor. To secure their yields, the landowners forced the peasants more strongly to the land. A new, second serfdom emerged. While freedom grew in the West, dependency deepened in the East. Thus the continent divided into two economic and social worlds. Here the rising early capitalism with free tenants, there the agrarian society of bound peasants. This dual path of Europe would shape the history of the coming centuries. The West developed into a space of cities, trade, and civil rights. The East remained more rural, hierarchical, fixed on the export of grain and raw materials. The plague had laid the foundations not by intention, but by consequences. It had not eliminated inequality, but redistributed it. But amidst these contradictions, something new began to grow. The consciousness that work possesses dignity, that knowledge means power, and that community can be more than obedience. In the cities, guilds and brotherhoods formed, representing their interests, regulating prices, protecting apprentices. These associations were the germ cells of the modern bourgeoisie. From them emerged those values that would later fuel trade, education, and art. A new culture in which man, no longer just God, stood in the center. Thus the uprisings of the 14th century became not only rebellions against hunger and distress but birth pangs of a new epoch. The pain of change was great, but it led to an awakening. Europe learned that change is not ordained from above, but enforced from below. And while the peasants and citizens fought for rights, the thinking of artists, writers, and scholars also began to change. Death had plunged the world into darkness, but out of this darkness formed a new language, the language of life, of memory, and of the human. After the years of darkness, as the echo of the death knells slowly faded, Europe began to speak, quietly at first, groping, searching for meaning in all the suffering. The Black Death had not only destroyed bodies, but also the idea that the world was immutable. Those who had survived saw themselves with different eyes. Life was suddenly a precious, fleeting good. From this experience grew a new aesthetic, a new language, yes, a new consciousness, born of proximity to death. The watchword of this epoch became memento mori, remember that you must die. It was not a threatening call, but a quiet reminder to respect life because it is finite. In churches, on cemeteries, and on city walls, depictions appeared capturing the inevitable in images. Death appeared no longer as an end, but as a companion. In painting he appeared as a skeleton dancing, mocking, equal with emperor, pope, peasant, and child. These scenes, later called the Dance of Death or Dance Macabre, became one of the most powerful symbols of their time. In Basel-Lübeck, Lachaise, Diu, and Cloisonne, Great frescoes were created where death dances with all strata of society. The motif was at once comforting and shaking. It said, "Before death, all are equal," and perhaps in this equality lay a justice that life itself could not offer. The dance of death was not a celebration of despair, but a mirror of the time, an attempt to give form to the incomprehensible. Tomb art also changed. The proud knight figures of earlier centuries gave way to so-called transy sculptures, depictions of the deceased as a decaying body with sunken cheeks and surrounded by worms. This unsparing imagery was not a morbid game, but an expression of new honesty. Man no longer wanted to be remembered only as a hero, but as a mortal, as one who is part of the great cycle. Parallel to this, the language of literature changed. Before the plague, Latin was the language of the church, science, and scholars. But the Black Death had swept away many of these scholars. New scribes, clerics, and chroniclers had to be trained, often with lesser knowledge of Latin. To truly reach people, authors began to write in the languages they spoke, the language of the people. Thus arose a cultural revolution. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote his Decameron between 1349 and 1353, a collection of stories about people fleeing to a country estate from the plague and telling stories there about life, love, and fate. It was a work of humanity, permeated by humor and compassion, a celebration of life right in the shadow of death. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote his Canterbury Tales, and in France, the poetry of Eustache Deschamps emerged, capturing the suffering of the time in everyday language. For the first time, the common people found their voice, and literature began to become human. Art became more honest, more direct, more personal. In music, one recognized the same change. Choral chants, once carried by sacred grandeur, were permeated by melodies that sounded more emotional, more earthly. In Italy, the first polyphonic compositions emerged, in which several voices sang independently of each other, a musical symbol for individuality. This artistic opening was more than a change of style. It marked the beginning of a new way of thinking. Man stepped into the center. The experience of transience led him to interpret his own life, with pen, chisel, brush, or voice. Death, which had extinguished everything, paradoxically became the midwife of individuality. Memory itself also took on a new meaning. Cities erected memorial stones and foundations for the victims. Monasteries kept books of remembrance in which the names of the deceased were preserved, an early form of collective memory. Memory became a duty. Whoever survived had to tell, had to remember, to give meaning to the past. Thus, from the silence of the cemeteries grew a new culture. Memento mori was no longer a call to fear, but a call to awareness. It reminded that life is valuable precisely because it passes, and that beauty, love, and knowledge are the only things that can outlast death. But the story did not end here. From the art of remembering soon emerged another movement. People who directed their gaze no longer only to the hereafter, but to the here and now. Wealth, education, worldly curiosity. They all became driving forces of a new time. When looking back at the 14th century, it seems as if the world had held its breath. The Black Death had changed everything: the landscape, society, faith, indeed even the concept of man. But in this deep wound something new began to grow. The plague was not a pure end. It was a transition, brutal, painful, but creative. From the rubble of an old order formed the world we know today. The world of cities, science, individual freedom, and modern reason. The first great consequence of this upheaval showed itself in the economy. Death had not destroyed capital. The houses, the coins, the tools remained, but they belonged to fewer people. Those who survived suddenly inherited everything. Land, cattle, workshop, house. In Florence, Siena, and Venice, this led to an unprecedented concentration of wealth. Families like the Medici, who had previously been merely skilled moneylenders, rose to be the bankers of kings and popes. With their wealth, they sponsored painters, sculptors, and architects, not out of pity, but out of pride and ambition. Art became the language of a new class that wanted to show it did not need old noble blood to achieve greatness. But wealth alone does not explain the Renaissance. It was above all a spiritual awakening. Man, who had experienced in the years of the plague how fragile life was, now turned to the question of what this life actually meant. He sought meaning no longer only in eternity, but in the here and now. Thus emerged humanism, the return to the thought of antiquity, but also the discovery of man as the measure of all things. In the studios of Florence, in the universities of Padua, in the workshops of Nuremberg, people began to see the world with new eyes. The artists of this time painted no abstract saints anymore, but people with emotions, with doubts, with bodies of flesh and blood. In Giotto's frescoes, the figures looked at each other as if they knew they were feeling beings. In Petrarch's writings, the soul spoke directly, without ecclesiastical mediation. And in the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci, curiosity combined with science, a testimony to the new faith in the power of the intellect. This spiritual opening did not remain without consequences for religion itself. The plague had shown that the church did not have answers to everything. Faith in authority began to crumble. What remained was the need for personal access to God. This development culminated a century and a half later in the Reformation. When Martin Luther posted his theses in 1517, the ground had long been prepared by centuries of mistrust, but also of self-responsibility grown in the plague times. Equally profound was the change in science. The observations doctors and city administrations had collected during the plague about contagion, air, hygiene, and isolation formed the first building blocks of empirical thinking. One began to trust experience instead of dogmas. From this attitude later emerged the scientific method: hypothesis, observation, proof, a quiet but decisive revolution in thought. But the plague had not only changed thinking and faith, but also the environment itself. Whole regions that had been depopulated turned into forests. Fields that no one tilled anymore became habitats for wild animals. Archaeological and climatological studies show that reforestation after the plague even measurably lowered the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. An early unintended ecological reset. It was as if the earth itself had taken a breath of recovery. Thus the circle closes. The plague had destroyed what had supported the Middle Ages, the belief in an immutable divine order. But it had also created the conditions for a world in which man began to shape things himself. Out of fear grew insight, out of powerlessness responsibility, out of the end a beginning. The long aftereffect of the Black Death reaches to this day. In every vaccination, in every health regulation, in every idea of human rights and social responsibility, echoes the memory of that time when Europe learned that salvation comes not only from above, but also from the community. So when one looks today at the frescoes of Florence or holds the printed words of Luther in hand, one sees not only art or theology, one sees the trace of a vast transformation that began with an invisible bacterium. Death had not extinguished Europe, it had recreated it. And so our journey ends not with despair, but with the realization that even in the deepest darkness, the ability of humans to learn, to create, and to hope remains stronger than any pestilence. For the true legacy of the Black Death is not death. It is the life after. When we look back today, centuries later, at those years when the Black Death forced Europe to its knees, we see not only a tragedy, but a lesson about the essence of being human. This history is no distant chapter of dusty chronicles. It is a mirror in which we can recognize ourselves, for it shows how insight grows from suffering, how responsibility arises from fear, and how even the deepest abyss carries the seed of a new beginning within it. The people of the 14th century did not give up. They loved, although everything seemed lost. They built, although cities lay in ruins. They thought, although the heavens were silent. In their courage to carry on lies the origin of our modern world. Without their despair, there would be no Renaissance. Without their doubts, no Reformation. Without their observations, no medicine as we know it. Perhaps the history of the Black Death reminds us that we too, in our crisis, our fears, our losses, are part of the same long narrative, the unshakable search of man for meaning and hope. Every generation has its plague, whether visible or invisible, and everyone finds their own way to live on. So the next time you enter an old cathedral, look at a painting from the Renaissance, or simply hear the sound of a church bell, Think for a moment of those who did not give up 7 centuries ago. Their pain became our strength. That is the legacy of the Black Death. Not death, but the rebirth of life. If you enjoyed this journey through the past, let us know what you take from it. What thoughts, what feelings, what parallels do you see to the present? Write it down in the comments. Your voice belongs to this history. And if you love such journeys through history, subscribe to the channel, share the video, and accompany us on the next paths through the times. For history lives in every one of us.